Good afternoon. I guess I know everyone here, but I still will do a formal and presentation introduction of myself. I'm Geneviève Zabriskie. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology, Director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Today we have the pleasure to host Sébastien Pérouse, who's a research professor, the Central Asia program in the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, and a senior fellow at the East-West Institute. His main research areas are political systems in Central Asia, economic and social issues, Islam and religious minorities, and Central Asia's geopolitical positioning toward China, India, and South Asia. He has published several monographs such as Christians Between Atheism and Islam, Studies of Religion in Soviet and Post-Soviet Central Asia, published in French at Maisonneuve-et-Larose in 2003, and in English, Turkmenistan, Strategies of Power, Dilemmas of Development at M.E. Sharp in November 2011. We're extremely pleased to host him today for our last noon lecture in the series on minorities that we've been developing all year. He will be presenting today on a lecture between political and social constraints, Christian movements in contemporary Central Asia. So we're very pleased to have actually someone talk to us about religion. We haven't really heard about religious minorities and religious minorities in that region of the world specifically. So please join me in welcoming Sébastien Pérouse. Did you want this or that?
Maybe that. I forgot to put, yeah.
Please turn off your cell phones if you have that on.
Okay. All right. Thank you first so much, Geneviève, for your invitation. Thank you, and all the institute for organize this event for me. Thank you, Liz. I mean, I know you worked hard to organize everything. I'm really, really happy to be here today. So yes, I will talk about Christian movements. I just one thing. I changed slightly the title. I put between religion and ethnic identity, which I think goes better with what I'm going to present today. So as Geneviève said, what I would like to do is to talk about religious minorities in Central Asia, and I will focus on Christians, which, as you know, is a main, by far, is a main religious minority in Central Asia. And I will try to address some of the impacts, challenges, and questions that Christian communities, Christian denominations have been facing in the region for these last 2 decades. I mean, even more than 2 decades since independence. How actually the different Christian movements have tried to keep their presence in the region. Some of them have tried to have developed actually pretty well, but some of them have tried to survive. And I will address some questions that, I mean, some of the questions that these movements' presence have raised, especially one which is how Christian movements affirm or legitimize their often very visible presence in the region and the responses of both the Muslim population and the political authorities in the countries of Central Asia. Okay, so well, I guess you all all of you know that, but all the republics of Central Asia count many religious minorities. I mean, Jewish. You have also Muslim minorities like Shia Muslims. And as I said, there are plenty of Christian minorities in Central Asia. So the main one is, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church. But Christianity is not only the Russian Orthodox Church in Central Asia. It's also, you also have the Catholic Church. You have plenty of Protestant denominations, like Lutherans, Seventh-day Adventists, Baptists, Pentecostalists, etc. And you also have, an Armenian community in Central Asia with several Armenian churches, and you have a Ukrainian community with a few Uniat churches, especially in Kazakhstan. And of course, most of Christians in Central Asia belong to Slavic and European minorities, so Russians, Germans, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainian, as I already said, Germans, Poles, and you have also Armenians and Koreans. So I put a chart here with some figures of national minorities still living in Central Asia, which I collected from very different sources. So we have to be careful about these figures because, well, again, I took them from very different sources. Some of them might be a little bit old. Some of them are taken from some census done in 2012, so already a few years ago. And for some countries, it's pretty complicated to have really reliable figures, especially from Turkmenistan. But I put this chart to give you an idea of the national minorities we have in Central Asia. And a new phenomenon, which is really interesting, which occurred actually, especially after independence, after the fall of the Soviet Union, is that more and more natives, Uzbeks or Tajiks or Kazakhs or Kyrgyz or some Turkmens, have been converted to Christianity. You have many missions, especially Protestant missions, which have been very active in the region. It's, of course, very difficult to estimate the number of converted, but let's say, just to give you an idea, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, which is a country where there's Christian missions have been the most active, we estimate that there are about 20,000 Kyrgyz converted, not Kyrgyzstani, Kyrgyz converted to Christianity, to some Protestant movement. So that remains, of course, a very small minority, but at the same time very visible, and which raised some questions. What is important to know is that not all, but many of the Christian denominations that I'm talking about, which are present today in Central Asia, were have been present actually in the region for a long time under the Soviet regime, but even before the Soviet regime. And like everywhere else in Soviet Union during the Soviet regime, most of these movements in Central Asia had a difficult time until at least the perestroika, but all survived. And the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of Central Asian republics raised, of course, many questions, both for Christian individuals, but also for the churches as structures and for their leaders. So after independence, there's been a growing interest in religion. First, because for plenty of reasons, I won't have time to talk a lot about that. But first, because independence was viewed as a new era of religious freedom after Soviet atheism. But for plenty of other reasons, religion could be, for example, could be viewed as a refuge for people, facing economic troubles or social difficulties or just questions of identity. Second, Christian believers and movements switched from a Soviet context in which they had to fight, as I said, for their own existence in an atheist regime, to independence with some Central Asian specificities. Christianity is not only a religion of minority, but it appears as also a symbol of Russians or of Europeans or Westerners in a Muslim land where political authorities are mostly Muslim. So this new political context raised many questions, concerns, especially in the beginning of the 1990s, right after independence. You have some Christians, some people of national minorities who have feared that Islam could become a kind of official or very privileged religion at the expense of the rights of Christian minorities. A third, all movements present in the Soviet period had to face a main issue, that is the new European population immigration. Many Russians, Germans, and other minorities left the region, left the Central Asian republics, which they viewed independence and economic difficulties in Central Asia as a threat to their statute and to their future in the region. And this immigration has been a major, I would say, handicap for the Christian denominations, which so far mainly consisted of European minorities, and which therefore lost many of their believers or parishioners. And this immigration led to the closure of several communities, including in big cities where European population used to be concentrated. So, for example, many Germans left Kazakhstan, for instance, and and because of that, you had, for example, quite a lot of Lutheran communities which had to close. And fourth, with religion freedom officially decreed, at least officially, in Central Asia, in each republic, this led to an increased competition among Christian movements in the region. And this competition increased all the more that some foreign movements, some foreign missionaries came from. Some missionaries, came from and were funded, were supported by foreign countries, especially from Europe, from the United States, and also from from Southern Korea. So it was really a new phenomenon, and many long-established Christian churches in Central Asia, like the Russian Orthodox Church, really had to face a growing competition of other movements. So, of course, all these questions and concerns have driven each Christian community, each Christian parish, to think of necessary measures to develop, or for some of them just to survive in this new context. And this has raised many questions on what should be Christianity in Central Asia, on which churches which churches or denominations are legitimate in the region, on which criteria their legitimacy lies, for example, on the principle of Christian universalism, as many denominations advocate, or on a historical legitimacy based on historical presence of several churches in the region. And another very fundamental question which has been regularly raised is, who are actually the Christians in Central Asia, or even in a growing authoritarian political context in the region? We could ask the question in a different way: who is authorized actually to be a Christian in Central Asia. And this has raised many debates on an alleged or contested link between religion and nationality. Nationality here being taken in the sense of the Pietipunkt on the passport, so as the ethnic identity. So should, the question is, which has been debated a lot in Central Asia, is should only some national minorities who traditionally are considered as Christian, especially Europeans such as Russians or Germans, or Armenians, be allowed to be Christian in Central Asia? And in that case, are all Christian churches legitimate in Central Asia? Or again, on the principle of a Christian universalism, should anybody in Central Asia be viewed by Christian denominations, especially the active proselytizing ones, as a Christian or as a potential Christian? And all Christian movements, of course, responded through their tactics of development, through their decisions, through their relations with local populations, with Christians, but also with Muslims or whoever, how they view or contest the link between religion and ethnic identity, or religion and individuals' culture. So to put it in a, to put it in a very schematic way, because I don't have much time to talk, but there are two types of approach. First, the churches which have opted for, which have chosen an intrinsic, which have advocated an intrinsic and even reinforced link between religion and ethnic identity, and which have been reluctant to proselytize. And second, movements which have relativized or even denied this link, and who have opted for development by an active proselytism. So the first one and the main one is a Russian Orthodox Church, which has really postulated an indissoluble relations between Russianness and Orthodoxy, which therefore appears more as a national than as a universalist religion. This has been, I mean, in Central Asia, the Orthodox Church has repeatedly published, insisted on this link in many discourses, in many articles published in the Orthodox journals of the region. The Russian Orthodox Church has been carrying on this principle by its reluctance to proselytize, and especially to convert non-Slavic believers or natives. By natives, I mean so Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and so on. And for example, it was very interesting. I had several interviews in the 2000s with some Uzbeks or some Kyrgyz who were telling me that, well, they were interested in Christianity. They wanted to know more about this religion, and considering that the Orthodox churches in the region are among the most visible, so they went to see, they went to these Orthodox churches, and they were actually pretty coldly welcome. I mean, they were really asked, said that, well, you as an Uzbek, you cannot really be a Christian, which means that, I mean, many of them went to other churches where they were much more welcomed. I mean, yeah, so for many individuals, I mean for many minorities like Russian in Central Asia, so the affirmation of a strong link between religion and nationality has been all the more important since several republics have progressively excluded several European cultural expressions, and especially targeted the Russian one, especially, for example, in Turkmenistan and in a least measure in Uzbekistan. And the church has been viewed for many Russians, that's what I heard actually from interviews. The Russian Orthodox Church has been viewed as a kind of last refuge for Russian culture. For example, the prayer houses, the churches enable people to meet compatriots, while the liturgy uses multiple specific cultural aspects such as icons. Of course, well, this strong connection I'm talking about between ethnic identity and religion is not specific to the Russian Orthodox Church. You have exactly the same thing with the Old Believers. There are very, very few now Old Believers community in Central Asia. You just have, as far as I know, a few of them, maybe 2 or 3 in Kazakhstan. But you also have some Protestant churches which have this kind of approach, and especially the Mennonites and the Lutherans, which have been really insisting on this link between religion and ethnic identity, between religion and culture, but of course this time not Russian, but German. And the leaders of the Mennonite communities really tried to foster their German national traditions. I could have some interviews with some of them, and what I heard is that questioning the German specificity of the movement would have entailed weakening their faith founded on fidelity to all generations and origin land, that is Germany. So the preservation, for example, of German language has been viewed as a fundamental criterion of opposition to the Russification, which has occurred, for example, in other Protestant movements, such as in Baptist Church or Seventh-day Adventist Church. And another example is, again, the Lutheran Church, which all the religious practice in the church is really imprinted with German references and values. But, sorry. This does not mean, of course, that these choices have not generated debates within the communities. There have been different approaches, sometimes within the same community. I saw a very strong debates inside sometimes the same church. And this brings me to the second approach, which is more opening and proselytism in the name of universalism, but also because for many religious communities in Central Asia, having enough members is mandatory, is indispensable, is really mandatory to survive, legally speaking, because all the churches have to register with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, with the Ministry of Justice, and they need, in several of these countries, they need a minimal number of members. So this really pushed some of them to do real proselytizing. And actually, most Christian movements have decided to proselytize in Central Asia. Of course, well, proselytism is, I go quickly, but proselytism is very different from one denomination to another. Some have been particularly active. This is the case, for example, of several, especially of several foreign Protestant missions, including the evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostalist churches. And proselytism also varies in its form, the method used, and the chosen targets. And this is, I will talk about the targets because I think that's really an interesting point. So first, you have actually 3 potential targets for proselytism. First, people who are Christian by culture or tradition. For example, as I said, Germans for Protestant movements, Poles and Germans for the Catholic Church, and Russians for the Orthodox Church. So according to these churches, considering that the Soviet regime had repressed religious practice, a majority of the Russian or German or Polish population must be brought back into the ranks of the church. And this is actually one of the only forms of proselytism, very slight proselytism, that the Orthodox Church authorizes itself in Central Asia. Second target are that the believers or members are supposed to be members of other denominations. So you had many members of, for example, the Lutheran Church, which left the Lutheran Church and went to some more dynamic Protestant movements like the Baptist or the Seventh-day Adventist or Pentecostalist. And the third and main, most interesting point, at least what I would like to insist today, is on the proselytizing of Muslims. And here I define Muslims in a very, its wide meaning. I mean, Muslim by Muslim believers, but also people who consider that they are Muslim just because they belong to a nationality, which is traditionally Muslim. So that is all the Central Asian titular nationalities, but also several minorities like Uyghurs living in Central Asia. And if you look at some figures, I mean, it's very hard to have some real sociological surveys in Central Asia now, but if you look at some figures, especially those provided by the Pew Research Center, you have more than 92 or 93% of Kazakh or Kyrgyz or Uzbek or Tajik who consider themselves as Muslims. And it is this proselytism of believers to other denominations, but also and especially of Muslims, which calls into question the link between religion and ethnic identity, or rather, I would say it reshapes this link, or even more precisely, it leads the missionaries, the Christian missionaries, to reshape to their advantage this link. I will explain. So, after 70 years of Soviet atheism, natives are really viewed by missionaries as have been viewed as a kind of easy target. Very often, actually, missionaries don't talk about Kazakhs or Tajiks as Muslim. They characterize Central Asia as having a Muslim tradition or a Muslim background or Muslim customs. So they, in a way, I mean, trivialize Islam in Central Asia by insisting that Islam only has a superficial influence on several of these countries, on their cultures, especially, for example, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, which were Islamized much later than Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So they reinsist that Islam is more, I mean, what I heard from missionaries is that Islam is more a question for Central Asian people. Islam is more a question of identity, but an identity that makes sense mostly in opposition to Russians. So according to missionaries, they practice a tolerant and traditional Islam, sometimes without theological grounding. That's not, I don't say that, that's what they say. Then they would be susceptible to leave their religion and convert to Christianity. And what is interesting is that in 20 years, we have seen a kind of evolution where, for example, in the 90s, most of missionaries, Christian missionaries, established churches along some very strictly defined denominational lines. So this is the case, for example, with Baptists, with Seventh-day Adventists or Pentecostalists. These churches, of course, are still very present there and are still very active. But we also saw, I would say, from the end of the 90s, or maybe more from the beginning of the 2000s, a significant group of, or at least a growing group of missionaries whose aim was to escape denominational categorization and present themselves as non-denominational or as evangelical. And these groups have tried to promote to create a local church, for example, a Kazakh church or a Kyrgyz church or a Tajik church. And they've tried, even more than Baptist or the other Protestant churches, to autochtonize Christianity in Central Asia. Of course, I mean, there's movements, there's missionaries are aware that their action can provoke some negative reaction in the Muslim population who view many of them view Christianity as a foreign religion. But according to many missionaries, there's negative attitudes of Kazakh or of Tajik or of Kyrgyz towards Christianity should be attributed not to Islamic conviction, but to people's quest for national identity. So for more and more missionaries, in order to weaken the argument that Christianity is a foreign religion, again, a religion of Russians or a religion of Germans, or from any other countries. For them, it is crucial for missionaries, for more and more missionaries, it is crucial that a Kazakh stays a Kazakh, a Kyrgyz stays a Kyrgyz after conversion. And here I refer to an excellent article published by a great anthropologist working on Christianity too in Central Asia, Matthijs Pelkmans, who shows that these movements have really tried to reshape this relation between religion and ethnic identity, between religion and culture. Matthijs Pelkmans studies especially the Kyrgyzstan case, but because it's indeed the most interested. I mean, Kyrgyzstan had a kind of pretty liberal legislation which has enabled many Christian missionary movements to be present, to be active in this country. But actually, you find the same kind of approach in Tajikistan and in Kazakhstan. It's much more limited in the two other countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. For one main reason is that proselytism has been officially banned. And if I schematize a little bit, you find actually two main steps in missionaries' approach to the local Muslim population. The first one is de-Russifying Christianity, and the second one is Central Asianizing Christianity. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can say that, but well, just inventing a bad word. Well, so first, since independence, I already briefly mentioned that, but Christianity has had a kind of Russian connotation. I've heard several times in interviews from Central Asian Muslims that, for example, Christianity is a foreign religion or Jesus is a Russian god. And Christianity has been very often associated with the memory of the Russian Orthodox Church in the region and with people, I mean, having some foreign worship, such as, for example, using icons. So many, more and more, missionary movements have tried to de-Russify Christianity to overcome this kinds of negative cliché, and evangelical missionaries have to do that. Evangelical missionaries have have really tried to show their differences with Orthodox Christianity. Well, which was not, in a way, very difficult to do because, I mean, the services of evangelical congregations are very different from Orthodox services, and they don't use the Orthodox symbols and signs and like icons, etc. But this differentiation effort has gone really further. We have seen some evangelical movements avoid, for example, the word Christian, because of its Russian religious connotation, and instead talk about followers of Jesus. we have also seen a diversification of some religious or biblical terms, and Mathis Beckmans explains that very well. I mean, the Russian biblical terms have been replaced with some Turkic or Arabic equivalents. For example, the Russian word Biblia has been substituted with the Arabic word Injil, which means Gospel or New Testament. And then the second step, the next step, is to Central Asianize, to Kazakify, to Kyrgyzify Christianity. And we have seen more and more missionaries, and I would say young missionaries, who claim to value the preservation of Kazakh or Kyrgyz culture among converts. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, what you can see is that the setup in several churches, for example, was arranged to stress some specific aspects of local culture. In some churches, you see everyone, including the pastor, that's reported by Mathis, sitting on carpets on the floor. I mean, and that I've seen everywhere in Central Asia. In some churches in Central Asia, the songs are in Kazakh or in Kyrgyz or in Tajik. In the 90s, in Uzbek too, but well, this has been banned now. But some typical Central Asian instruments are used to play the music. So by doing that, the missionary shows that the Christian message is for everyone, and that all cultures are equal or equally special. So the culture that evangelical movements promote is Central Asian in form, but and Christian in content. So there are therefore two fundamental conceptions of Christianity here. Christianity is not Russian, but Christianity is universal. But this Christian universalism does not intend to break the link between religion and local culture, since Christianity is also Kyrgyz, Uzbek, or Kazakh, or Tajik. And of course, this provoked reaction. I mean, the quick development of some foreign Christian movements and the conversions of natives have aroused have provoked some hostile reactions from the Muslim clergy. And I mean, don't get me wrong, a huge majority of Central Asian Muslims are extremely tolerant to Christianity or other religious movements. But pressures have grown against the religious movement whose proselytism is really obvious, or against, I quote, there's two smiling girls whose essential goal is to divide the Muslim people. That's what I had in one of an article published in Central Asian newspapers. So Christian proselytism, can be viewed as a source, can become a source of conflict between Muslim populations who consider that natives must be de facto Muslims, and several Christian denominations which view them as potential Christians. Yeah, I mean, you have some Christian proselytized movements which have been accused, for example, to take people away from their own religion and cultural traditions. And a change towards another religion is seen can be seen at least as a betrayal of their country, of their culture and their ancestors, and therefore of their family. And I've heard from Central Asians, what I've heard actually from Central Asians is that many of them sincerely doubted whether a converted Kyrgyz or a converted Uzbek should be seen as a Kyrgyz or an Uzbek. So this has also resulted in the banishment of some converts from some families and local communities, and in attempts to bring converts back to their native religion, that is to Islam. And the reactions actually are sometimes even stronger. Some Christian groups have been accused of stealing the cultural markers of the Muslims. Let me give you one example here. Some evangelical movements have used the rite of circumcision and have organized even some circumcision celebration in order to bring actually closer together Christianity as perceived, so by these Christian movements, with Muslim traditions. The Christian some Christian movements also appropriate several cultural markers, like, for example, national dresses, food, music, that is in Central Asia are usually associated with Muslimness. But by doing that, missionaries really try to show that Christianity is compatible with Central Asian identities and with local culture. And when accused of destroying culture by Muslims, I mean, missionaries actually defend themselves by saying that they are doing exactly the contrary. But as I said, even if a huge majority of the Muslim population are extremely tolerant to other religion, you had, since the 1990s, more and more incidents, which are don't occur so often, but you had more and more several confrontations actually between some Muslim with some Christian communities. And even more medias and narratives have more and more addressed what is presented as I quote, an evangelical threat. The media portrayed, for example, evangelical churches sometimes as totalitarian cults, accusing them to brainwash their members. I just quote what I read from different sources. Point is that the conviction that money plays, for example, a very important role in conversion is really, really widespread. And this is important because this argument is a way to discredit both the Christian movement and the converted, because instead of having started to believe, converts are said to have sold their faith. They are accused to have betrayed their religion and their nation for inferior motives. To be for sure, I mean, there's allegations on money are not totally, completely unfounded. I mean, some movements have been supporting or providing some financial help. Now, that said, has this narrative been efficient to counter the competition of evangelical movements? I'm not totally sure, because also the accusation of monetary payment discredit, again, missionary intention and deny the sincerity of a conversion experience. They, in a way, also assist the efforts of evangelicals by providing an incentive for people to attend church services. And some converts confirmed, I mean, in some interviews I had, that their first interest actually was raised by rumors or about financial rewards, or at least about financial help or of any other form of support. And so, but now the Muslims are not the only one who reacted to Christian proselytism, or more specifically to Protestant proselytism. And one of the churches which has the most complaint about that is the Russian Orthodox Church, which has been really upset. I heard that so many times from Orthodoxies, really upset by the leak of their believers, the leaks of Russian believers leaving the church and going to other Protestant movements. So the Orthodox Church has really used common rhetoric with Muslims, insisting on the fact that traditional Muslims people should remain Muslim, and as I already said, by insisting on the link between ethnic identity and religion. Both, and so what you read, what you hear is that both religions have agreed to share their role and their influence in Central Asia. So the Orthodox hierarchy really does not stop mentioning in conferences, in meetings, its mutual understanding with Islam, asserts, and I quote here, that Islam is closer to Orthodoxy than any other Christian movements. And so you have a kind of rewriting of history too. For example, some somewhat embarrassing elements of the Russian history in Central Asia are forgotten, especially an anti-Muslim mission that the Russian Orthodox Church launched in Central Asia. I mean, Protivo-Musulmanskia Missia, which was launched in the end of the 19th century. How long can do you have now? 5 minutes. Oh, okay. But to summarize, I mean, the view of how the Russian Orthodox Church thinks is that, according to it, everywhere on the space colonized by Russia, so in Central Asia and everywhere else in the former Soviet Union, a Christian would have to be Orthodox. So there would be only two exceptions. First, people originating from non-Slavic ex-Soviet republic, whose history and culture are bound to another religion. For example, of course, again, Islam for Central Asia, and Azerbaijan, or the Armenian Church for Armenians. And second, people whose nationality is culturally bound to a church situated beyond the former USSR borders. So that is, for example, the Catholic presence is accepted for Poles and a part of the German population, and there is Lutheran Church for the other part of Germans, as long as these movements don't proselytize among Russians. And this allegedly, I mean, this link between religion and ethnic identity advocated by the Orthodox Church and by Muslims have had an impact on how religious movements are managed by the political authorities and on the legislation, actually, on proselytism and on religion in Central Asia. This really has led the Central Asian governments to adopt and revise their rhetoric, which is inspired by a terminology used by the leaders of religions in the region, so Islamic and also Russian Orthodox leaders in Central Asia, but which is also actually borrowed from the Soviet regime. It distinguishes between traditional religions on the one hand and non-traditional religions on the other hand, which are often presented as extremist movements or as sects. So the traditional movement, according to political authorities in Central Asia, are the one who belong to, or the traditional religion is the one that belongs to the titular population or to major religious minorities present in the country. So again, Orthodox Church for the Russians, or Lutheran for the Germans, Catholic for Germans and Poles, and who have a historical presence in Central Asia. Whereas sects are generally the new religious movements, including evangelical movements, who, by destroying or by challenging the link between religion and ethnic identity, would, according to the government, threaten social stability and challenge the independence of the republics. So some movements which have been present since even before the Soviet regime, since the Tsarist regime, such as Baptist and Adventist, are tolerated in varying degrees in each republic. But at the same time, those who are supported by foreign missionaries and those that who came to Central Asia since the beginning of perestroika are very often viewed as foreign movements and can be repressed or can fall under the government's pressure very easily. And this classification has really allowed the political authorities to marginalize any community that tries to extirpate itself from the imposed structure of control that the government is trying to maintain. But that said, I mean, 2 points here. First, of course, there's rules, and their applications vary a lot from one republic to another in Central Asia. Some, like, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, are much more tolerant than others, whereas the legislation in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan is much stricter. And these rules are not specific to the republics of Central Asia, but you find that in other CIS republics. And finally, all of that had an impact on some aspects of religious legislation. In practice, religious legislation has become much stricter everywhere in Central Asia if you compare the freedom you had at the beginning of the 90s with what you have now. For example, I already mentioned that, but registration formalities of all religious movement with the Ministry of Justice has become again, as in Soviet times, mandatory in most of the states. So, and any groups which cannot get registration or which refuses to apply is considered as illegal. And registration has been actually refused to many Christian communities, especially in Uzbekistan and in Turkmenistan. And the main targets are usually the movements which are considered as non-traditional or suspected to be funded by some foreign movements, by some foreign churches to support proselytism. So what we saw, especially in Turkmenistan or in Uzbekistan, is that some communities were refused registration, even though they fulfilled all requisite conditions. So, as in the Soviet regime, another pressure really consists in suppressing the registration of some two proselytizing communities. Proselytizing, by the way, has been explicitly banned in several republics, in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And as a main tool for proselytizing, the distribution of literature remains very suspected, frowned upon by political authorities, and even banned in several republics, again in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And an important point is that actually Uzbeks or Turkmens converted to Christianity have been particularly targeted by the political authorities' repression, both in an official but also in a non-official way. Uzbeks, for example, in the Baptist movement have been much more harassed than anyone else, Russian or German, or even if they are the members of the same movement or the same parish. So, I'm sorry, I really have to finish. I'm late. So, very quick conclusion. I mean, three short points. So I was talking about more and more restrictive legislation and more control on Christian movements. But I would like to say that most of this restrictive religious legislation is targeting actually much more, in a way, the Muslims than the Christians in Central Asia. That's really important to have that in mind. The focus of the governments, Central Asian governments, remains the control of Muslims and of Islam. So it's probably, I guess, now today, easier to be or at least less risky to be a Christian than a very practicing Christian than a very practicing Muslim. I explain. For example, a Christian could go every day to the church with very few risks, to have any kind of trouble or harassment by the police. Whereas we have plenty of reports of Muslims going every day to the mosque, and we have been arrested just because they were considered as too practicing Muslim. And this happened very often, unfortunately, in Uzbekistan. Second, the link between religion and the ethnic identity, which has been challenged or reshaped by what I was saying by Christian movement, is actually more and more challenged or reshaped by a part of the Muslim population itself. Also, most Central Asians continue to conceive of their ethnic identity as inseparable from Islam. This claim is now increasingly under attack. More and more Muslim believers, and I would say especially young people, young Muslims, speak of their other central Muslims as people who call themselves Muslims, but in fact are only superficially Muslims. And they criticize and contest the pairing of religion and ethnic identity because, in their view, faith should transcend ethnic and national categories. And my last point, beyond the strict control over religious movements, every religious movement in Central Asia suffers, that's important, the consequences of new measures aiming to control the whole civil society in Central Asia. For the political authority, for the Central Asian political authorities, political stability and national identity have been threatened by the growth of new religious movement or foreign movements. And the political authorities view these new movements as a threat in the fact that the political authorities no longer have the discursive upper hand they used to have during the Soviet regime. So the religious movements, whether Christian or Muslims in Central Asia, root their power in global communities which are united, for example, through textual authorities, whereas the political authorities, on the other hand, must appeal to the authorizing power of a state which has actually failed to gain much credibility since independence. So while the religious movements or new religious movements are able to lean on their global network to help Central Asians to deal with their economic difficulties, especially in the post-Soviet period, the political authorities can only look at a state which has been actually less and less able to provide the economic support that the population needs. So aware that they are not able to win the argument, the political authorities have more and more tried to discredit the religions by attacking their authoritative base, and have more and more vilified, I would say, a religious movement. So the context of, and I will refinish on that, the context of Christian movements in Central Asia is first a part of a more general control over religion in all the region, and a part of a control over the whole civil society in Central Asia. And I will stop here, I talk too long, sorry.
Oh my. Thank you, Sebastian, for the talk. I have a couple of questions that are sort of related about evangelical strategies. I'm thinking here of Justin Wilford's book about sacred subdivisions, and he talks about how in the United States context, evangelical churches have been especially successful in sort of leveraging the logic of sort of the post-suburban lifestyle that's very disconnected. Do you see similar things? What are the strategies that evangelicals are using to attract people? Because simply saying, well, you know, we're going to have circumcisions and play local music, I don't think is probably enough to cause people. And then what kind of theological arguments are they using? You know, I'm thinking of in Kyrgyzstan, both the State Commission for Religious Affairs and the Mufti both sort of say, okay, it's not just any Islam that we have, but it's the Hanafi Islam, it's the Maturidi Kalam. It respects local traditions like visiting mazars and these sorts of things. And so I guess the two questions, it's a two-pronged question. What are the sort of spatial strategies? Do we see this mostly in urban areas? Do we see this mostly in rural areas? And also, what are the theological arguments that evangelical movements are using to attract followers?
So on the theological arguments, I've not worked a lot on that, but you have, I mean, a lot of strategies. First, you have proselytism everywhere. You know, first it was, I mean, the 1990s, they were mostly focusing on urban areas. Now, I mean, you have that, at least in Kyrgyzstan, I mean, not in Uzbekistan anymore, but you have that both in urban and rural areas. And you have very different strategies. First, by, well, saying that again, as I was explaining, that, well, Islam is just a tradition, and that, well, in a very different way, they try to present Christianism as more, I mean, relevant religion, and they try to associate, I mean, Christianity with other, I would say, advantages that appeal to the local population. What I saw a lot is that Christianity is often associated with Western, with the West. What does that mean is that I explained that sometimes Christianity is criticized because it's a Western religion, but at the same time, being a Western religion for a lot of people, it means that, well, we might have more contacts with Western countries. It's a way, maybe one day, to emigrate in a Western country. And also it's a way for a lot of people, and as I was saying, that you could get some support, financial support, because these Western churches are viewed as wealthy churches, and in many cases they are actually, because they receive a lot of funds from Western countries. And one example I saw very regularly with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You know, this church is focusing a lot on developing medical centers. They have done that a lot in Central Asia. And for a lot of Central Asians who are extremely poor, who just don't know where to find a good doctor, especially at a time when all the healthcare system is in Central Asia is either falling apart, I mean, some republics, or either extremely corrupted. For a lot of poor people, they just can't pay. I mean, or they would have to pay. I mean, yes, a big amount. They just can't do that. So you know, they see the Adventist Church as a way to, well, finally have a good health, to see a doctor. And you know, you have, I mean, plenty of strategies like that. You have a lot of I mean, distribution of religious literature where it's still authorized. Again, in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, you can do that. But in Kyrgyzstan, you know, or you had the Jehovah's Witnesses who were, I mean, you see, you have that everywhere in the world. But I mean, they're very active by distributing religious literature, and in a way, they play on this religious literature by showing them as some modern movements, you know, with very beautiful and well printed journals compared to the Orthodox Church, which, has much less money, doesn't receive a lot of money from Russia. So, they really use a lot of arguments related to a kind of trying to present themselves as modern movements and as movements connected to Western countries.
Thank you for that thought-provoking speech, Professor. I was particularly interested in your talk about connecting ethnicity with religion, and it got me thinking: is it either A, particularly successful, or B, a particular strategy to target ethnic minorities in other countries? I'm thinking maybe particularly Uzbeks inside of Kyrgyzstan or other situations such as that.
Well, I think the main I haven't seen a specific ethnic minority, specific success in one specific minority. I have seen actually most of, some groups from very different national minorities or of different nationalities being really part of the Central Asian churches. I mean, I've seen, in the 1990s, I saw some groups, for example, in the Baptist Church, which consisted only of Uzbeks. In Kyrgyzstan, you see, Kyrgyz, you see some Uzbeks. There are also some Uyghurs. I've seen some Uyghurs groups in some Christian churches. I haven't seen any minority, or so-called traditionally Muslim minority being specifically, more involved in Christianity than another. I might be wrong, but the main factor for missionary movements is actually not who they are aiming, but it's what is the legislation in these countries. Again, in the 1990s, even in Turkmenistan, in 90, it was limited, but in Turkmenistan, I visited in 1996 a Seventh-day Adventist and a Baptist church, and there were just a few, but there were few Turkmens. Today, just forget about it. It would be impossible. The same in Uzbekistan. Well, in Uzbekistan, you still have some Uzbeks, but as I was saying, they are really under the pressure of the political authority. It's very hard for an Uzbek to be a Christian now. So really, the main factor is what is the legislation, what is the tolerance by the political authorities to this Christian movements.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering if you'd come across in your interviews or in your research any of these. You mentioned sort of a second wave of trying to nativize these newer Christian movements in Central Asia. Have you come across anyone trying to harken back to, because there actually is a Christian tradition in Central Asia that goes back before even the coming of Islam to Central Asia. It was there for 5 to 10 centuries, the Nestorian Church of the East and Central Asia. Have any of these new movements tried to harken back to that, or?
No, on the historical debate, I've never, I might be wrong, but I haven't seen really some real references on the Nestorians or the Melkite Church, which were there much before the Islamization of the region. When we talk about history of, and when they use the historical argument to legitimize, they mostly talk, for example, about the fact that they were there during colonization. So the Orthodox Church say, look, we came to Central Asia in the 18th and 19th century when we were colonizing when the Russians were colonizing the region. by the way, the Orthodox Church uses this argument by saying we were the first, to what the Catholic Church and Protestant movement say, no, 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 we went with you, we were with you because we as Germans, we as Poles were going with you, we colonized at exactly the same time the region. Or you have another argument given by the Catholic Church, is that there were some Christian missions in the 13th century in Central Asia, and they use that. So the history is used in that way. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, again, using the Nestorian argument, I haven't seen that much. It might be used just to say, okay, Christians have been here for a long time, but it's not really something that you see very often in other writings.
Hey, so this might be a little bit of a tangent, but so I was thinking about my experience in Kyrgyzstan and sort of looking at the sorts of persecution some of these groups face, and at least in a Kyrgyz context, and this isn't, obviously this is different in Uzbekistan, but a lot of the sort of repression and persecution that these groups face isn't necessarily actually coming from a political context, like as you were saying, they have other concerns, they're busy regulating Islam, but actually what we could call social regulation of religion, right? So local Muslim leaders and Muslim communities that, are very suspicious, particularly of these non-Russian Orthodox Christian groups. One major hot button issue in the last few years has been burials in cemeteries, where, you'll have Baptists that will pass away and they won't be able to find any local cemetery that will accept them to be buried, right? So I guess my question is this, in your interviews with these organizations and speaking with people representing these organizations, are there any efforts that are being taken to normalize these Christian groups, not in the sense, not in a proselytizing or attempting to get people to convert, but like from an interfaith dialogue perspective, right? So trying to engage with Muslim communities, not to get converts, but to normalize what they're doing and basically to say, hey, we're Kyrgyz too. Hey, we're part of the community. I know there are some NGOs that are doing work on this, but I was just curious, since they occupy this sort of, again, I'm not really talking about the Russian Orthodox groups. They occupy this sort of space on the periphery where, there's already this suspicion from Muslim groups that any interaction that they're going to have is going to be, they're going to be trying to convert you, and it's bad. So how do they navigate this and attempt to normalize their position with these other, Muslim religious communities?
Yes, so actually, yes, you have plenty of talks, plenty of meetings between, Christian communities, Christian priests or Christian pastors. So I was talking today a lot about these negative reactions that Muslims could have against to proselytizing movement. But thank you for this question, because I want to insist that at the same time, I was saying that first, Muslims in Central Asian Muslims are extremely tolerant with towards other religions. But second, relations between many Christian movements and Muslims are really good. You have a lot of meetings, you have a lot of conferences in Central Asia, which of course are organized by the government, which for the political authorities it's very important to prove that they are able to manage to keep stability and to keep peace between the religious movements. But I've seen them, when I was working there, really having excellent relations. And so these conflicts I was talking about, raising conflicts I was talking about between some two proselytizing movements, or they're viewed as two proselytizing movements, remain a minority. And I was talking about incidents between Muslims and Christians, but again, that's a really, that's rare. That remains rare. Well, there are more, for example, now than in the 90s. But I wouldn't say that you have plenty of conflicts in Central Asia between Christian and Muslim. No, not at all. And another point is that there's proselytizing movement, or some movements which whose parishes have decided to proselytize, sometimes can provoke some conflicts inside the same community. What I mean is that, for example, I saw some. I mean, I had some interviews, for example, in a Baptist church, where some pastors were saying we don't want. I mean, we have to be careful with proselytizing because we just don't want to provoke any negative reaction from the Muslim population. And at the same time, in the same community, some others saying, no, we have to be more offensive. We have to really push, I mean, to develop proselytism, to develop. And these three sometimes, provoke some kinds of conflict inside the community. So I'm saying that just to show that, I mean, you have very different approaches. And so again, I would say many Christian communities, many Christian priests or pastors have really tried to talk with Muslim representatives, to talk with Muslim population, to talk with the political authorities, and it has worked pretty well, actually.
Hey, thank you for an interesting talk. I have a very long list of questions, which I don't have time to ask, but what I thought I would do is basically just ask you two questions. And I'm sort of thinking in an odd way about the story, The Hound of the Baskervilles and the dog that didn't bark in the night. And I want to ask about two things that aren't in this sort of story of religious, ethnic kind of differentiation. And so one is in setting this up as a story of ethnic identity associated with ethnicity or not. One thing that's not in play in listening to you talk is like what would have been present for certainly all the grandparents of the people involved in this story, and many of the parents too. And that's 75 years of the Soviet experience. And we've got sort of scientific atheism as like an overridingly enunciated, re-enunciated, kind of articulated way of thinking about what religion is, what it means, how it should be approached, what evangelicalism means, and so on. So that sort of complicates this, and I'm just wondering whether that's just completely dropped out of the field of view entirely, and it's been subsumed by this like much more ethnicized vision, or if it's still sort of percolating through the ways that these groups are talking, in ways that people like Sonia Lerman have found, even in the post-Soviet landscape. And the second is intermarriage, because that's a place that this sort of ethnic model runs into real problems, right? It's complicated, and that has to do with conversions potentially going both directions. Spouses have to make decisions what they'll do about religion. When you have kids, you got to decide what happens with the kids. And so I'm wondering how you have that, is that talked about here by these groups or by the authorities, whether religious or political?
Well, thank you, Doc. Well, on intermarriages, interesting marriages in Central Asia, there remain very few. If you see intermarriages between European or Slavic minorities with Uzbek or Kazakhs or Kyrgyz, they remain very limited, which means that intermarriages in which you have one of the person in the couple would be a Christian or Muslim. I mean, I haven't seen, well, of course it exists. I mean, I haven't worked some. I'm sorry, I haven't worked so much about that because I haven't seen that much actually. So on your sorry, I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. What did you?
No, it's okay. It's a long day. So the first one was about atheism and like the whole place of like what we think about religion when we attack religion. There's a spot in which potentially at least faith groups could be making a case that we all have something in common. We all sort of have a belief in something out and beyond. We're not this sort of secular, sort of self-consciously secular anti-religious approach. That's not at all the picture that we've got in the talk. So I'm assuming it's not present in the way they're articulating it. But I'm wondering whether you still see the influences of that prior multiple generations of talking about how religion is to be enunciated and addressed.
Yeah, I mean, you still have this this narrative, as you have, by the way, a kind of nostalgia for the Soviet Union in Central Asia. Really, but I mean, you still have a narrative which is transmitted from one generation to another, from grandparents to people now. Really insisting on the fact that, well, under the Soviet regime, we had no freedom, and that indeed we have a common ground, we have a common goal to develop a religion, to develop religion. I would say that I don't see that often now. I think I see that less and less compared to the 1990s. But this remains one of the arguments, yes, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.